I'm reading from chapter 19 called The Boulder, and this is part 3. I had an infection and I was off school, and I knew then for sure that we would never lift our boulder. It would stay there forever, guarding its secret. But anyway, I had to put that out of my mind now, because I had to think about getting better and then doing well in my scholarship test. When I got back to school, after weeks of being poorly, Mr. Bantam had taught the class lots more things. I even heard that Virginia was having special lessons at night after school, paid for by her mum and dad. And Edmund was sitting another exam for a very special school in Hull. He didn't want to go to our Ripsey school. I bet both of those people were born in April, when Mr. Bantam said all the cleverest people were born. Then one day, ages before I'd caught up with all the work that needed to be done after I'd been off school, it was time for the scholarship. That dark day was on me. When I woke that morning, I felt as trapped as those men in that tunnel under the stone. And I knew for sure, whether I liked it or not, there was no way back for me. I was really very scared. I just had to be brave. There was nothing for it, and I knew that I could be brave. Mum ironed my pleats back in my skirt for my big day, and I looked very smart. Then Mum smiled at me and told me to breathe in that fresh air to help me do well and to feed my brain. But I had an even better idea. I went upstairs and got my charm bracelet from my cracker box, and I put it up my sleeve with my hanky. It would help me if all else failed. We sat in a big room. It was made from Mrs. Gray's classroom and Mr. Bantam's classroom, with the screen folded back like a concertina. It was a huge room now, and we all could spread out. It was so that we couldn't see each other's papers, and we couldn't copy, and I wasn't even allowed to sit near Brenda. "Now turn over your test papers and begin," shouted Mr. Bantam. And I turned to the page and I began. I concentrated and tried to remember everything that I had learnt. There wasn't a question about my bushel, though. But anyway, I answered all the other questions that were there. "Put your pens down." It was over. We just had to wait while Edmund and Virginia, who were monitors, collected our papers, and then we all tumbled out into the playground. And the sun was shining, and my charmed bracelet jangled in my hanky, and I skipped about and breathed in that fresh air, and I laughed. Anybody can do anything. Things got back to normal at school. Even Reverend Robinson seemed to be his usual self. He'd got some more candlesticks to replace the ones that had been stolen, because I heard Uncle Sid say that the insurance had paid for the replacements, and they had to be kept in a cupboard now and locked away. But he still had his candlesticks back, and that must have pleased him. But then one day at school, Mr. Bantam said we had to write a story about hiding your light under a bushel. This was a Bible story we'd heard Reverend Robinson talk about. So it was very unusual because, as I've said, you didn't usually have to listen to Reverend Robinson and what he was talking about. I suppose Mr. Bantam was running out of things to do with us now that we'd done our scholarship and we would be leaving his school. Anyway, we had to get our pens out, and Virginia filled our inkwells with ink. She didn't need any, and neither did Edmund, because they had their own pens, and they even had their own bottles of ink. I didn't think I'd be able to write anything. I got bored with Reverend Robinson and his bushel story. But strangely, I started thinking about what Auntie Vera had said about the men under the boulder, and I started to work things in my head, and I used my brain, and I started to write. I wrote about the robbers who stole the candlesticks. There were 3 men in my story, and just as they got hold of the candlesticks in the church, they heard somebody coming, and they escaped into the underground tunnel. This entrance was hidden under a stone on the church floor, and so they would have been safe because they carefully put the stone covering back in place behind them. They ran down the tunnel, and nobody knew where they'd gone. Then suddenly there was a rock fall behind them. But they didn't notice and hurried on, and it was so dark that they even lit the candles on the candlestick they'd stolen to see their way out. They soon got to a massive boulder at the exit. Now that boulder, humped over the tunnel, was like a bowl turned upside down. In fact, the people in the village told me later that they called it the bushel boulder. Then disaster struck for the 3 men, because no matter how hard the robbers tried, they could not push that boulder away. They heaved and strained from below, but it would not budge. There was no going back for them either because of the rockfall, and so they died, and their light went out. And that is where the saying comes from, "Don't hide your light under a bushel." But that was not the end of my story. I made some more up. Nobody knew where the men were until one day Uncle Sid came along with his tractor and chain, which he tied round the massive boulder, and with one heave he dragged it away. I wish I'd thought of asking him before. I don't know why I didn't. But when the villagers looked down into the hole, out came a great musty smell, and round it all the pale leaves came trying to grow into the light. And then everybody gasped, because there was a sight of 3 white skeletons, and their twig fingers were wrapped around the stolen candlestick. So in my story, Reverend Robinson got the very same candlesticks back. I thought that was a lot better than what really happened, and he got some new ones from the insurance money. And he was so pleased that he asked God to forgive the robbers, which of course he did. And so the robbers got a decent burial in Gum churchyard after all. A week later, just before home time, Mr. Bantam sat us all down and said he would read us a story. That was very strange. He didn't usually do that, as I've said, but probably he didn't know what to do with us now we were all going to leave fairly soon and go to Ripsey. Edmund wasn't going though, because of course he'd passed his exam for that posh school in Hull. Anyway, we all listened, and I was really enjoying Mr. Bantam's story, when I thought, just a minute, I've heard this before. And do you know, he was reading my bushel story, and my light was suddenly really shining, and everybody was listening, and just by him saying it out loud, It seemed to be as if my Uncle Sid really had moved that boulder with the tractor. And when Mr. Bantam had finished, he told the class it was my story. And he gave me sixpence. And I wondered if it was that very same sixpence that I had given him back all that time ago. But there was more, because he said that all the cleverest people must be born in May as well as in April, so that counted me in. I was clever. And so I could put being clever on my what I am good at list at last. And that was all I wanted. Because you see, if you were clever, you could pass your scholarship. And that was sure to happen now. I would pass. Mum and Dad would be so proud of me after doing so well. And there was really nothing to be scared of after all.